The bright lights of the Melissa Grant show blazed against the sleek, glassy backdrop of the Los Angeles studio. The hum of the live audience swelled as the camera panned across the crowd. This wasn't just any episode, this was the episode. The kind people would talk about for years to come. Melissa Grant, a sharp-tongued, no-holds-barred talk show host in her mid-30s, had built her reputation on asking the questions no one else dared. Known for her aggressive style and provocative interview tactics, she had brought down celebrities, politicians, and tech moguls alike. Her fans loved her boldness. Her critics called her ruthless. But tonight, she faced a man who didn't play by the rules. Clint Eastwood. At 94 years old, Eastwood remained an American icon. Actor, director, producer. His face, rugged and lined with decades of life and wisdom, had graced the silver screen since the days of black and white westerns. Yet, there he was, stoic, composed, and wearing that signature squint as he waited for Melissa's first shot. He had nothing to prove. But Melissa? She had an agenda. The audience roared when Clint walked onto the stage. Dressed in a classic navy blazer and an open-collared white shirt, he exuded the quiet confidence of a man who had seen it all and wasn't about to be rattled. Melissa extended her hand, her manicured fingers clutching his with a firm grip. "Welcome, Mr. Eastwood," she said, her voice dripping with a mix of charm and challenge. Or should I say, the last cowboy standing? Clint chuckled softly as he lowered himself into the leather chair. "Call me Clint," he said, his voice low and gravelly. Melissa's smile was razor-sharp. "Clint it is," she said, leaning forward. "So, let's get right into it. You're known as Hollywood's tough guy, but isn't it time to admit that maybe, just maybe, you're a little outdated?" The audience murmured, sensing the tension. Eastwood didn't flinch. "Outdated?" he repeated as if tasting the word. "Depends on what you mean by that." Melissa's eyes gleamed. She had him exactly where she wanted him. "Well," she said, tapping her cue cards, "your movies are rooted in a bygone era. Rugged men, lone heroes. In 2025, isn't that message a little toxic?" The word hung in the air. For a moment, Eastwood just stared at her. That legendary squint narrowed a fraction more. "Toxic," he echoed quietly. The way he said it sent a ripple through the crowd. Melissa, sensing the weight of the moment, pushed harder. "Yes, toxic. You know, this idea that men can't show emotion. That strength means silence. Don't you think younger audiences are tired of the strong, silent man trope?" Eastwood shifted slightly in his seat. His face was impassive, but his eyes glinted with something fierce. "You're asking if people are tired of men with values," he said. "Respect. Duty. Standing up for what's right. I'm not sure when that became a bad thing." The audience applauded quietly at first, then louder. Melissa tilted her head. "I'm not saying values are bad. But don't you think your work glorifies a kind of masculinity that no longer fits modern society?" For the first time, Eastwood smiled, a slow, knowing smile that hinted at 1,000 stories he'd never tell. "Let me ask you something, Melissa," he said, his voice smooth as whiskey. "When the world falls apart, when everything goes wrong, who do you want standing beside you? The person who talks about their feelings or the one who does what needs to be done?" The room fell silent. Melissa shifted in her chair, clearly unprepared for how quickly the tide had turned. But she wasn't about to let him take control. "Isn't that a false choice?" she challenged. "Why can't we have both?" Clint leaned forward, his gaze never wavering. "Because when it's life or death," he said softly, "you don't have time for both. You need someone who doesn't blink when things get hard. And if you think that's toxic, maybe you've never been in a real fight." The studio erupted in applause. Even some of Melissa's producers, watching from the wings, exchanged raised eyebrows. This wasn't going the way she planned. Melissa forced a smile, but there was an edge of frustration behind it. "Okay," she said, brushing a lock of hair behind her ear. "But isn't it true that your politics have rubbed a lot of people the wrong way? Especially your famous empty chair speech?" A flicker of amusement crossed Eastwood's face. "You mean when I said what half the country was thinking?" he asked. "I wasn't there to make friends. I was there to tell the truth." Melissa laughed, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "And you don't regret it?" "Why would I?" Eastwood's voice was steady. "The truth doesn't change because it makes people uncomfortable." And with that, the interview was no longer a game of cat and mouse. It was a masterclass in composure, and Clint Eastwood was in charge. Melissa crossed her legs, her posture tightening as the audience's applause finally died down. This wasn't going the way she expected. Usually, by now, her guests were backpedaling, offering half-hearted apologies, or squirming under the weight of her questions. But Clint Eastwood? He sat there like a granite statue, calm, unshakable, and entirely in control. She decided to change tactics. If challenging his masculinity didn't rattle him, maybe poking at his age would. You know, Clint, Melissa began, her tone adopting a playful but pointed edge, you've had quite the career. But with all due respect, don't you think it's time for the old guard to step aside and let the next generation take the reins? A few audience members chuckled. Melissa smiled as if she had landed a solid punch. But Eastwood didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly as though considering her words carefully. You're asking if I'm too old to matter, he said, his voice as smooth and lethal as a revolver being cocked. That's a fair question. The crowd quieted again. Melissa leaned in, sensing an opportunity. I mean, Hollywood's changing. We've got new voices, new perspectives. Isn't it time to make room for them? Clint let out a soft, almost amused sigh. Funny thing about experience, he said. You can't fake it. You can't download it. And you sure as hell can't replace it just because someone younger walks through the door. The audience murmured their agreement. Melissa, undeterred, pressed on. But don't you worry that your style of storytelling, men with guns, justice served through violence, feels outdated? People want stories that reflect modern values, don't they? For the first time, a flicker of steel crept into Eastwood's voice. Melissa, I've spent over 60 years telling stories, he said, his eyes never leaving hers. And do you know what people want? They want truth. They want heroes who don't quit when it's hard. And believe it or not, they still want the good guys to win. His words hung heavy in the air. Melissa adjusted the cuff of her designer blazer, refusing to back down. But is that good guy image realistic anymore? Life's complicated. Maybe people are tired of black and white morality. Eastwood chuckled softly, the sound low and dangerous. Life's always been complicated, he said. But here's the thing, there's still right and wrong. You can dress it up however you like, but at the end of the day, someone has to stand up when nobody else will. The audience broke into applause again, louder this time. Even Melissa's loyal fans seemed captivated by the sheer weight of Eastwood's words. She tried to laugh it off. Okay, but let's be honest, there are critics who say your films push outdated ideals of masculinity. Don't you think it's time to evolve? Clint's smile faded. He leaned forward slightly, the intensity in his gaze sharpening. You know, he said, his voice quieter but somehow even more commanding, the people who talk about outdated ideals usually haven't been in a position where those ideals matter. Melissa blinked. For the first time, she seemed unsure of what to say. When you're staring down danger, Eastwood continued, you don't want a discussion circle. You want someone who's steady, who's got your back. And you can call that old-fashioned if you want, but I call it necessary. The room fell completely silent. Melissa shifted in her chair, her confidence visibly shaken. I suppose that's one way to look at it, she said, her voice softer now. Eastwood didn't smile. He simply nodded. It's the way that's kept people alive for a long time, he said. Melissa Grant wasn't used to being on the defensive. For years, she had built her career by challenging the rich and famous, exposing contradictions, and breaking down carefully crafted public images. But Clint Eastwood wasn't crumbling, he was turning the tables. And the audience knew it. Still, Melissa wasn't ready to back off. She had one more angle, a more personal one. If she couldn't beat him with logic, maybe she could rattle him emotionally. So, Clint, she began, adjusting the microphone clip to her collar, you've talked a lot about standing firm and not apologizing for your values. But if we're being honest, you've had your fair share of controversy. Do you ever think, looking back, that you could have handled things differently? Maybe shown a little more sensitivity? Eastwood raised an eyebrow, the faintest hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. Sensitivity, he repeated slowly, as if weighing the word. What exactly do you mean? Melissa's tone grew sharper. Well, for instance, she said, glancing at her notes, your 2012 Republican National Convention speech, you know, the one where you talked to an empty chair. A lot of people thought it was bizarre. Some said it disrespected the presidency. Any regrets about that? Clint shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable. But when he spoke, his voice was steady and clear. No, he said. Not a single one. The audience erupted again, this time with a few audible cheers. Melissa blinked, caught off guard by his bluntness. No regrets, she repeated, her voice tightening. Even though people called it unhinged? Eastwood leaned forward slightly, his presence filling the space between them. Melissa, he said, when you've lived as long as I have, you learn something important. People will always have opinions. But opinions don't change facts. The crowd murmured in agreement. And the fact is, he continued, I didn't go there to make people comfortable. I went there to speak the truth. If some people couldn't handle it, well, that's not my problem. Melissa laughed lightly, but there was an edge of frustration beneath it. Okay, but let's be real, don't you think that kind of bluntness is part of the problem these days? We live in a world where words carry more weight than ever. Shouldn't people, especially public figures, be more careful? Eastwood's expression grew serious. Careful, he echoed. I've spent my life being careful where it matters, on a film set, in a director's chair, and on the streets. But when it comes to speaking my mind, no. I'm not here to dance around people's feelings. The crowd clapped again, the sound growing louder with each answer. Melissa, sensing she was losing control of the conversation, tried one last push. But surely you see that the world is changing. Aren't you worried that your legacy might not age well with modern audiences? Eastwood's eyes narrowed slightly. My legacy? He said quietly. Melissa, I didn't spend 60 years in this business worrying about my legacy. I spent it telling stories that matter, stories about people who stand up when nobody else will. A hush fell over the room. And if that doesn't age well with some people, he added, leaning back in his chair, then maybe they're the ones who need to catch up. Melissa opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time that night, she was speechless. For a brief moment, the only sound in the studio was the soft hum of the cameras and the distant shuffle of the crew. Melissa Grant, usually quick with a comeback, found herself at a rare loss for words. Clint Eastwood, on the other hand, remained perfectly calm, like a gunslinger who knew he'd already won the duel. But Melissa wasn't finished, not yet. With a visible effort, she regained her composure and forced a smile. All right, she said, tapping her cue cards against the table, you clearly believe in standing your ground. But let's talk about something more personal. With everything you've accomplished, do you ever worry that your message alienates younger audiences? I mean, is there a point where you just say, maybe I'm out of touch? The audience chuckled softly, sensing the attempt to land a final blow. But Eastwood didn't laugh. Instead, he tilted his head slightly and spoke in that low, deliberate tone that had made him a legend. Out of touch, he repeated almost to himself. Let me tell you something, Melissa. He leaned forward just a bit, enough for everyone to feel the weight of his words. When I was growing up, nobody handed you anything. If you wanted something, you worked for it. You didn't whine. You didn't complain. You got up, put your boots on, and did the job. That's not being out of touch, that's being real. A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. And you know what else? He continued, his voice gaining quiet intensity. That message isn't outdated, it's timeless. Because no matter how much the world changes, hard work and personal responsibility will always matter. Melissa shifted uncomfortably in her chair, but Clint wasn't done. You want to talk about younger audiences, he said. I meet young people all the time who are tired of being told they're victims. They want to build something. They want to stand for something. And if a few people in Hollywood think that's out of touch, well, he let out a dry chuckle. I'm not here to impress them. The audience erupted in applause, this time louder and longer than before. A few people even stood up. Melissa's jaw tightened, her polished TV persona beginning to crack. She had built her entire career on controlling the narrative, but now the narrative belonged to Clint Eastwood. Still, she made one last attempt to regain the upper hand. Fair point, she said, her voice a little cooler. But critics would argue that your worldview is, well, simplistic. The world isn't a Clint Eastwood movie. Not everything is good versus evil. Life is complicated. Clint didn't flinch. He let the silence stretch just long enough to make everyone in the room hang on his next words. You're right, he said finally. Life is complicated. But there are still things worth fighting for. And sometimes you have to cut through the noise and stand your ground, whether it's popular or not. Melissa exhaled sharply, realizing she was beaten. She tried to pivot. Well, it's clear you're not backing down, she said with a tight smile. Is there anything that could ever make you soften your stance? Eastwood's eyes glinted with that familiar, unyielding fire. Melissa, he said, if I worried about softening my stance, I would have quit a long time ago. The truth doesn't change just because people don't like it. Another wave of applause surged through the studio, louder than ever. For the first time all night, Melissa had no comeback. The audience knew it. Clint knew it. And perhaps, deep down, even she knew it. The legend had spoken, and no one in the room would ever forget it. Melissa Grant, the queen of cutting-edge interviews, had faced off with politicians, billionaires, and Hollywood's elite, but no one had ever turned the tables on her quite like Clint Eastwood. Her usual sharpness, the weapon she wielded so effortlessly against other guests, now felt dull in the face of his unshakable composure. Still, her pride wouldn't let her surrender. With a breath to steady herself, she tried a softer approach. Clint, she began, her tone less confrontational, I'll give you credit, you've never wavered in your beliefs. But surely, there must be moments where you see the world shifting around you and wonder, is there any part of you that feels left behind? Eastwood didn't answer immediately. He let the question hang in the air while the audience waited in tense anticipation. Then, with a slow, deliberate movement, he leaned back in his chair and folded his hands on his lap. I've seen a lot of changes in my life, he said, his voice calm but full of authority. Some good, some bad. But the truth is people don't really change. Not deep down. They still want dignity. They still want to protect their families. They still want a fair shot at life. Melissa shifted in her seat, sensing that once again she was on the losing end of the exchange. The problem is, Eastwood continued, his eyes narrowing slightly, too many people today are more interested in tearing things down than building anything worthwhile. They criticize people who stand up, but they won't lift a finger themselves. A few heads in the audience nodded and murmurs of approval spread through the room. Melissa clung to her final card, a personal angle that she hoped might humanize him. You've built a legendary career, she said, forcing warmth into her voice. When you look back, what are you most proud of? Is it the films? The awards? Or is it something else? For the first time that evening, Clint's face softened just a little. The room grew still as he considered his answer. It's not the awards, he said quietly. It's the people. Melissa tilted her head, her curiosity piqued. The people? Eastwood nodded. Over the years, I've had the privilege of working with some of the best in the business, actors, directors, crew members. But more than that, I've met everyday folks. Veterans. Factory workers. Single parents. People who don't get their name in the headlines but who hold this country together. His voice grew stronger. And when I hear from someone who says one of my films gave them the courage to keep going or that they saw themselves in a character, that's what matters. Not the critics. Not the noise. The people. A deep silence settled over the audience, broken only by the faint sound of a camera clicking in the distance. Even Melissa, sharp-tongued and famously unsentimental, seemed momentarily moved. But Eastwood wasn't done. I didn't come here to defend myself, he said, his gaze locking onto hers. I'm not interested in winning arguments or playing by anyone else's rules. I'm here because there are still things worth standing for, and I'll stand for them whether it's popular or not. The applause started slowly, one person, then another, until the entire studio was on its feet. The ovation was thunderous, echoing through the room as Melissa sat there, speechless. For the first time in her career, she had been completely outmatched. When the cheers finally died down, Melissa forced a smile and reached across the table. Well, Clint, she said, her voice quieter than before, I may not agree with everything you've said, but I can't deny one thing. You've given us a lot to think about. Clint took her hand in a firm, unhurried grip. Good, he said simply. Thinking's a lost art these days. And with that, he stood up, gave a polite nod to the audience, and walked off the stage, leaving Melissa Grant, the media elite, and the entire country with a moment they wouldn't soon forget.